Somewhere beneath your feet, right now, wherever you're lying, there might be the remains of a civilization nobody remembers. Not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, an actual claim made by actual researchers and actual conspiracy theorists alike, that human civilization as we know it, the one with writing, cities, and recorded history, might not be the first. Some say it's not even close to the first. Some say we're the seventh. The number shows up again and again in certain corners of the internet, in certain old texts, in certain YouTube documentaries with dramatic music. The seventh civilization, as if history were a building with 6 floors already collapsed beneath us, and we're just now realizing the foundation was built on rubble we never bothered to examine. The claim usually comes paired with something even stranger. That evidence of these previous civilizations existed once, and it was removed, hidden, erased. By who exactly? That depends who you ask. Tonight, we're going to sit with that question, not to accept it, and not to dismiss it either, but to actually look. We're going to hold the extraordinary claims up against what geology can tell us, what archaeology has actually dug up, and what historical records genuinely say, as opposed to what people online say they say. Because here's the thing about deep time. 10,000 years is nothing to a river. 100,000 years is nothing to an ice sheet. If something truly ancient existed and vanished, the question isn't whether someone erased it. The question is whether the planet itself already did that job, slowly, patiently, without any conspiracy required at all. We'll walk through Göbekli Tepe and its impossible age. We'll look at drowned coastlines from the end of the last ice age, land that's now hundreds of feet underwater. We'll sit with flood myths from cultures that never spoke to each other and ask why so many of them sound the same. We'll even take seriously, just for a moment, something scientists call the Silurian Hypothesis, a real thought experiment about whether an industrial civilization millions of years ago could leave any trace at all. Spoiler, the answer is unsettling. But before any of that, I want to know where you are right now. Seriously, drop a comment. Tell me your city and what time it is there. I read these, and there's something quietly wonderful about knowing someone's listening in Lisbon at midnight, while someone else has this playing in Toronto during their morning coffee, all at the exact same moment, all drifting toward the same questions about deep time. It's one of my favourite parts of making these. If you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to long, strange, true stories like this one, the shows are also on Spotify, and following there genuinely helps more than you'd think. If you've got a spare minute before you drift off, a 5-star review helps even more. The link's in the description. It costs nothing, and it means everything to a small channel like this one. Now, let's start at the beginning of the ending. Before we ask what a 7th civilization might look like, we have to ask a much simpler question first. What would even count as a civilization at all? So, what actually makes a civilization? Not a smart species, not a clever tribe, not a group of humans who figured out how to make fire or chip a decent spear point. A civilization, in the way archaeologists actually use the word, means something much more specific, much more demanding, and honestly, much rarer than most people assume. Here's the distinction that matters. Intelligence is not civilization. Humans, and quite a few other species for that matter, have been intelligent for a very long time. Problem-solving, tool use, even symbolic thought. These things show up deep in the fossil record, long before anything we'd recognize as a city or a kingdom. A group of hunter-gatherers who can track a wounded animal for 3 days across open grassland, who can read weather patterns in cloud formations, who can teach their children complex survival knowledge that takes years to master. These people are unquestionably intelligent. They might even be brilliant, but they are not, by the archaeological definition, a civilization. Civilization means something structural. It means large numbers of people living in permanent, dense settlements, not just camping somewhere for a season and moving on. It means agriculture sophisticated enough to produce a surplus, extra food that doesn't get eaten immediately, which is the thing that allows some people to stop hunting and farming altogether and become something else instead. Bakers, tool makers, priests, soldiers, administrators. That surplus is really the hinge point. Without it, everyone in the group has to spend nearly all their time and energy just finding the next meal. With it, you get specialization. And specialization is where civilization actually begins. From there, archaeologists look for a whole cluster of supporting evidence. Trade networks, because a city can rarely produce everything it needs on its own. So you start seeing goods moving from one region to another, obsidian showing up hundreds of miles from its volcanic source, shells found deep inland, pottery styles repeating across huge distances, writing, or at least some standardized system of record keeping, because once you have enough people and enough surplus grain sitting in storage, someone eventually needs to track who owns what, who owes what, who paid their taxes in barley. Industry, meaning specialized production happening at scale. Not just one family making one pot for their own use, but workshops churning out standardized goods for wider distribution. And infrastructure, roads, irrigation canals, granaries, walls, temples, things built to last, things that require coordinated labor across many people working toward a shared planned goal. Put all of that together, permanent settlement, agricultural surplus, specialization, trade, some form of record-keeping, industry, infrastructure, and you get something archaeologists are willing to call a civilization. Take any one of those pieces away, and you might still have something remarkable. You might have a rich, complex culture. You might have a tribe with deep spiritual traditions and sophisticated oral history. You might have a technologically capable group who can build boats that cross open ocean or track the movement of stars with startling precision. But none of that, on its own, adds up to civilization in the strict sense. It's a high bar, deliberately so, and this is exactly where the phrase seventh civilization starts to wobble under its own weight. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no agreed upon archaeological definition of what number we're even counting. Ask 10 different historians to list the first great civilizations, and you'll get variations depending on how they define the term, which region they study, whether they count Mesopotamia and Egypt as one wave or two separate ones, whether the Indus Valley counts as its own distinct civilization or an offshoot of ideas moving westward, whether early Chinese dynastic culture belongs in the same conversation at all, given how independently it seems to have developed. The number 7 isn't a scientific figure. It's not a conclusion anyone reached by counting excavation sites and adding them up. It's a number borrowed largely from esoteric traditions, from theosophical writings from the late 1800s, from certain interpretations of ancient religious texts that speak of ages or root races or cycles of humanity rising and falling. It sounds precise. It sounds like it came from a lab. It didn't. This matters because language shapes belief more than we usually notice. If someone tells you that you're living in the 7th civilization, it implies a countable, verified sequence, like reading page 7 of a book where the first 6 pages definitely exist and definitely say something specific. But archaeology doesn't work off a numbered list like that. It works off physical evidence, layer by layer, site by site, and the picture that emerges is messy, regional, uneven, full of gaps and disagreements, which is honestly far more interesting than a tidy number, even if it's less quotable. So if we're going to take seriously the idea that a previous global civilization existed before recorded history, and then vanished so completely that almost nothing remains, we need to be honest about what kind of evidence that claim would actually require. It's not enough to point at one mysterious artifact or one temple built earlier than expected. A true prior civilization, one operating at a similar scale to our own, would need to leave behind traces across multiple categories at once. Widespread agricultural modification of landscapes, consistent architectural styles across large distances, evidence of long-distance trade, meaning materials found far from their point of origin, some kind of symbolic or written system, even a partial one, and ideally corroborating evidence from more than one independent research team, in more than one country, using more than one dating method, all pointing toward the same conclusion. That's the threshold. Not a feeling of mystery, not a shape that looks a bit too perfect on a satellite image, not an old text that mentions something strange, real evidence, converging from multiple independent directions. Which is exactly why, before we go looking for a lost seventh civilization, we need to understand something else first. Something almost nobody considers when they imagine an ancient advanced society hidden beneath our feet. How long would any of this actually survive? Because the answer, it turns out, might explain almost everything. But before we start measuring what old walls, tools, roads and cities can survive, it's worth pausing over that number, 7, because it has a history of its own, not an archaeological history exactly, more like a history of stories, symbols, religious ideas, and eventually modern media. The idea that humanity has lived through several previous worlds is ancient. It appears in different forms in traditions from many parts of the planet. There are stories of golden ages followed by decline, stories of floods that erase a wicked or exhausted world, stories of fires, winters, earthquakes, and great waters, stories in which the universe does not move in a straight line from beginning to end, but turns like a wheel, creation, growth, destruction, renewal. Then the wheel turns again. That basic pattern is deeply human. People live through droughts, floods, famines, wars, volcanic eruptions. They watch forests burn and return. They see winter take the fields, then spring bring them back. It makes sense that many ancient cultures imagined history itself as a cycle. Worlds could die, but perhaps they could also be reborn. In ancient Greek thought, for example, poets described a succession of ages. Hesiod wrote of a golden age, then silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. The point was not that archaeologists should go out and excavate 5 separate global civilizations, each with its own ruins, hidden beneath the next. These ages were moral and poetic categories. The Golden Age represented a distant time of ease and harmony. The Iron Age, the age Hesiod believed he lived in, was harder, more unjust, more burdened by labour and conflict. It was a way of saying, life feels difficult now, and perhaps people were better once. That feeling has never really gone away. In South Asian religious traditions, the idea of vast cycles of time became even more elaborate. Hindu cosmology includes yugas, great ages that unfold in a repeating sequence. The best-known version describes 4, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. In this framework, the world gradually moves away from righteousness and balance, eventually reaching a difficult age before the cycle begins again. The time spans involved are enormous, often reaching far beyond ordinary historical chronology. Now these traditions are rich, complicated, and interpreted differently by different communities. They are not a single, simple timeline, but modern writers sometimes lift the yugas out of their religious and philosophical setting and treat them as a literal record of forgotten technological societies. A sacred cycle becomes a spreadsheet, a symbolic age becomes a date range, and before long, someone is confidently announcing that an advanced civilization must have existed 12,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, or in some version, millions of years ago. The ancient text did not necessarily say that, but the modern interpretation is very appealing. You find a similar pattern in the stories of Mesoamerica, Among the Aztec or Mexica, there were traditions of successive suns, previous world ages that ended in catastrophe. One world was destroyed by jaguars, another by wind, another by fire, another by flood. The present world was often described as the fifth sun, a fragile age that also carried the possibility of destruction. It is dramatic material, 5 worlds each ending in disaster, followed by the next. You can see why people looking for lost civilizations are drawn to it. But again, the story was not a field report. It was cosmology. It explained why the world was dangerous, why rituals mattered, why the sun required care and sacrifice, why human life existed inside a larger and unstable order. It was not meant to provide a catalogue of buried continents or a list of prehistoric empires. And then there are flood stories. So many flood stories. Mesopotamia had them. The Hebrew Bible has Noah. Greek mythology had Deucalion. Indian traditions include Manu, warned of a great flood by a fish. Many other cultures preserve stories in which waters cover the land, people escape, and a new beginning follows. Sometimes these are connected to real regional disasters. Rivers do flood, coastlines do change, tsunamis can erase settlements in a single afternoon. But a flood story does not automatically prove a single global flood, and it does not automatically prove that an advanced worldwide civilization was washed away. What it proves, at minimum, is that people remembered water as powerful enough to end a world, and for a village beside a river, a world can be quite small. If your fields vanish under mud, your homes collapse, your relatives are swept away, and the boundary between land and sea moves inland, then your entire known universe has been destroyed. You do not need a planet-wide catastrophe for a story to feel universal. You only need a catastrophe large enough to overwhelm the people telling it. So where does the specific number 7 enter the picture? Partly because 7 has always carried symbolic weight. 7 days in a week, 7 visible wandering bodies in the ancient sky, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. 7 heavens in some religious traditions, 7 gates, 7 sages, 7 seas, 7 sacred mountains, 7 stages of ascent. Human beings love 7 because it feels complete. It has the neatness of a pattern without being as obvious as 3 or 4. But the version of 7 successive human civilizations, or 7 great eras of humanity, owes much of its modern shape to esoteric movements of the 19th century. This was an era obsessed with ancient wisdom. European scholars were translating texts from South Asia, Egypt, and the Near East. Archaeology was uncovering cities that had vanished from living memory. Geology was revealing that Earth was far older than biblical chronologies had suggested. Evolution was changing how people understood human origins. Into this mixture came writers who wanted to connect science, religion, myth, and hidden knowledge into one enormous story. One of the most influential was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a founder of Theosophy. Theosophical teachings described humanity as passing through a series of great developmental stages, often called root races. In some versions there were 7 of them. These were not archaeological civilizations in the modern sense. They were spiritual and cosmic categories, mixed with speculative ideas about lost lands such as Lemuria and Atlantis. The system borrowed language and concepts from several traditions, including Hindu and Buddhist thought, then rearranged them into a new 19th century esoteric framework. That distinction matters. Theosophy was not preserving a straightforward ancient census of 6 vanished global societies. It was creating a modern spiritual mythology, one that claimed access to hidden truths beneath conventional history. And it was influential. Very influential. Ideas about Atlantis, Lemuria, secret initiates, Forgotten epochs and repeating human cycles travelled through occult societies, popular books, early science fiction, New Age movements, and eventually television documentaries, podcasts, online videos, and social media. Each retelling simplified the previous one. Complex religious cosmology became proof of lost history. Theosophical root races became previous civilizations. A metaphorical age of decline became evidence they had technology we don't understand. And the number 7, with all its ancient symbolic force, became a headline. We are the 7th civilization. It sounds like a revelation. It sounds precise, even scientific. But when you trace it backward, the trail usually leads not to an excavation trench, a radiocarbon date, or a buried industrial site. It leads to a blend of mythic cycles, spiritual speculation, 19th century esotericism, and modern storytelling. That does not make the stories worthless. Far from it. Myths can preserve memories of real landscapes, real disasters, migrations, changing shorelines, and traumatic events. They can tell us what ancient communities feared, what they valued, and how they understood their place in the universe. They are evidence of human imagination and human memory. They are just not the same kind of evidence as a brick wall, a grain silo, a harbour, a mine, or a written account found in its original context. This is the quiet trick that makes the lost civilization narrative so persuasive. It begins with something true. Ancient people really did tell stories of earlier worlds. They really did imagine cycles of destruction and renewal. Some communities really did survive catastrophic floods, eruptions, and climate shifts. Then, almost imperceptibly, the story takes a larger step. If they remembered destruction, perhaps they remembered a civilization. If they remembered a civilization, perhaps it was global. If it was global, perhaps it was advanced. If it was advanced, perhaps someone removed the evidence. By the end, a symbolic story has become a hidden history. And that hidden history can feel more satisfying than the real one, because it gives every mystery a single answer. Missing ruins are explained by suppression. Missing records are explained by a cover-up. Contradictory traditions are explained as fragments of one ancient truth. The theory becomes difficult to disprove because every absence becomes part of the proof. But history is usually less tidy than that. Ancient stories deserve to be read carefully, not forced into roles they were never designed to play. And if there truly were earlier civilizations, whether 1 or 7 or 100, the question is not whether a myth can be made to sound like evidence. The question is what the physical world should still remember. Because Earth forgets many things, but it does not forget everything. Earth forgets many things, but it does not forget everything. The difficult part is learning what kind of memory we should expect it to have. Imagine leaving a modern city completely abandoned. No people maintaining roads, no pumps keeping water out of tunnels. No workers repairing bridges, roofs, drainage systems, power lines, or sea walls. At first, the city would still look familiar. Windows would break. Plants would push through pavement. Water would find every crack. Then the slow work would begin. Rain would seep into concrete and freeze in cold seasons, expanding tiny fractures. Rust would eat through steel. Roots would split foundations. Rivers would shift their channels. Storms would tear roofs away. In a few centuries, many buildings would be damaged beyond recognition. In a few thousand years, much of the city would be buried, scattered, or reduced to strange low mounds in the landscape. And that is without an ice age, a rising sea, a volcanic eruption, or a continent moving across the planet. This is the deep time problem. If a civilization existed far earlier than the ones we know, how long would its traces survive? And could an entire society disappear so thoroughly that later people would barely know it had ever existed? The answer is not a simple yes or no. Earth is very good at destroying evidence. But it is also very good at preserving certain kinds of evidence in unexpected places. Start with erosion. Wind, rain, rivers, waves, frost, heat, plants and gravity are all demolition crews working without rest. A mountain may look permanent to us, but even mountains are being worn down grain by grain. Stone walls collapse, carved inscriptions soften until the letters become unreadable. Roads crack, sink, and dissolve beneath soil. A building on an exposed hillside has very poor odds over tens of thousands of years. Give it enough time and its stones may be carried downhill, reused by later people or ground into sediment. But erosion is only half the story. The other half is burial. Sedimentation is what happens when rivers, floods, winds, glaciers and oceans carry bits of mud, sand, ash and gravel from one place to another. Over time, those materials settle in layers. A village can vanish beneath flood deposits. A harbour can fill with silt. A forest can be covered by volcanic ash. In some cases, burial destroys a site. In others, it protects it. This is one of archaeology's quiet paradoxes. A place that remains exposed may slowly disappear. A place buried quickly can survive for thousands of years, sealed below the surface like a message in an envelope. That is why archaeologists often find ancient settlements in river valleys, deserts, caves, peat bogs and dry regions where burial happened, but later disturbance was limited. It is also why finding something is never just a matter of asking whether people lived there. It depends on whether the landscape gave their remains a chance. Then there is tectonic movement, the vast machinery beneath our feet. Earth's crust is broken into enormous plates that drift, collide, pull apart, and slide past one another. The movement is slow by human standards, perhaps as fast as fingernails grow. But give it millions of years and continents travel thousands of miles. Mountains rise, basins sink, earthquakes rupture the ground, volcanoes bury landscapes beneath lava and ash. Oceanic crust is especially ruthless. It is constantly being created at mid-ocean ridges and pushed downward into Earth's mantle at subduction zones. Much of the ocean floor is geologically young. If a coastal civilization from an unimaginably distant past had sunk beneath an ocean basin that was later carried into a subduction zone, its physical remains would not merely be hidden. They would be recycled into the planet. That is real erasure. Not deliberate erasure, geological erasure. Glaciation can be just as destructive. During ice ages, glaciers spread across huge areas of northern Europe, Asia, and North America. These were not gentle sheets of snow resting quietly on the land. They were moving rivers of ice, sometimes more than a mile thick, carrying rocks and gravel beneath them like industrial sandpaper. As they advanced and retreated, they scraped landscapes clean, crushed deposits, rearranged river systems, and left fresh terrain behind. If a settlement had stood in the path of a major glacier, its survival chances would be poor. Not impossible, because buried objects can sometimes endure, but poor. The surface evidence could be ground up, transported, and scattered across vast distances. And then there is the sea. For most of human history, people have been drawn to coastlines and rivers. It is easy to understand why. Water offers fish, shellfish, transport routes, fertile soils, drinking water, and access to other communities. Rivers are natural highways. Estuaries are rich ecosystems. Coasts connect worlds. But these are also some of the least stable places on Earth. At the peak of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked in glaciers that global sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is today. The shorelines of that world were far beyond our present beaches. Broad plains now submerged beneath the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, and many other coastal regions were once dry land. As the ice melted, the sea rose, not in one single wall of water everywhere at once, but over millennia with periods of faster change. Coastlines moved inland. River mouths shifted. Lowlands disappeared. Camps, villages, pathways, and perhaps much more were drowned beneath sediment and salt water. So when someone asks why we have not found every early coastal settlement, the answer is simple. Many of them may be underwater, but underwater does not mean vanished beyond all possibility. The sea can damage sites with waves, currents, and chemical decay. Yet it can also bury them. Under the right conditions, submerged landscapes preserve stone tools, wooden structures, fish traps, animal bones, and even footprints. Archaeologists are beginning to map some of these drowned worlds, but the search is difficult, expensive, and still very incomplete. Now consider materials. Not all evidence has the same chance of surviving. Stone is the champion, massive stone monuments, quarries, tombs, foundations, and carved bedrock can endure for astonishing lengths of time, especially in dry and stable environments. They do not last forever. The pyramids are already weathering, but stone has a better chance than wood, cloth, leather, or ordinary mud brick. Metals are more complicated. Gold can survive beautifully because it reacts very little with its environment. Copper, bronze, iron, and steel are less fortunate. Iron rusts, bronze corrodes, aluminum oxidizes over deep time, metal objects may become stains, mineral crusts, distorted fragments, or nothing recognizable at all. Still, mines, slag heaps, smelting residues, and unusual concentrations of metals can leave traces long after a sword or machine has disappeared. Plastics feel permanent because we see them everywhere. But sunlight, oxygen, microbes, heat, and mechanical wear break many plastics into smaller and smaller pieces. A plastic bottle on a beach may not survive intact for very long in geological terms, yet its chemical fragments, microplastics, and associated industrial compounds may leave a strange signature in sediments. Not a neat message saying, "A civilization was here," more like a thin, puzzling layer in the rocks. Roads are also less immortal than they seem. Asphalt softens, cracks, and is invaded by plants. Concrete breaks apart, bridges collapse, but a large road network might leave flattened corridors, compacted layers, unusual gravel, drainage patterns, and traces of quarried material. A city may fade, the shape it imposed on the landscape can linger. Digital technology has perhaps the worst survival prospects of all. A laptop, a hard drive, a phone, a server farm, all of it depends on delicate materials, stable temperatures, controlled power, and constant maintenance. A digital archive can hold more information than an ancient library, but without electricity, software, compatible machines, and someone who knows how to use them, it becomes silent almost immediately. In a few centuries, much of our data may be unreadable even if the devices physically survive. So, a very ancient industrial civilization might not leave skyscrapers waiting patiently beneath the jungle. It might leave something stranger. This possibility has been explored through a thought experiment, sometimes called the Silurian Hypothesis. The question is not whether ancient reptiles built factories. They did not. The question is whether an industrial civilization, if one had existed millions of years before us, could be recognized through geological evidence rather than surviving artifacts. Industry changes the planet. It moves enormous amounts of rock. It burns carbon. It releases metals, chemicals, and pollutants. It alters sediments, soils, waterways, and atmospheric chemistry. A civilization operating at a global industrial scale might leave abrupt changes in carbon isotopes, unusual metal concentrations, synthetic compounds, traces of mining, or disruptions in the normal patterns of sediment and extinction. Those signals would be hard to interpret. Volcanoes can change the atmosphere. Natural climate shifts can alter carbon cycles. Geological processes can concentrate metals. Nature is fully capable of producing mysteries, but that is the important point. Difficult to find does not mean deliberately remove. Evidence can be lost through erosion, burial, rising seas, glaciers, tectonic recycling, and simple bad luck. Most of the past was never preserved. Most of what was preserved has never been found. And most of what has been found exists as fragments, not as complete stories. Still, a truly large and technologically advanced civilization would have changed more than one valley, one island, or one shoreline. Somewhere in the stone, mud, ice, ocean floor, or chemical record of the planet, we might expect the world to remember. But before we go looking for a vanished civilization, we need to ask a quieter question. What were human beings actually doing before cities existed? Because the years before Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and ancient China were not empty. They were not a blank hallway leading toward civilization, with a few confused hunters wandering around in the dark. They were filled with people, many different kinds of people. People making tools, tending fires, crossing dangerous landscapes, caring for one another, exchanging materials across long distances, decorating their bodies, burying their dead, and trying to make sense of a world far larger and more unpredictable than our own. The story of civilization begins late. The story of humanity begins much, much earlier. Homo sapiens, our own species, evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. That sounds unimaginably old. If all of recorded history were compressed into a single day, writing would appear only in the final minutes before midnight. Cities, kingdoms, taxes, archives, and armies would be even later. For almost all of our existence, humans lived without them. And Homo sapiens was never alone. Earlier human species had already occupied the planet for more than 1 million years. Homo erectus spread far beyond Africa, reaching parts of Asia long before our species appeared. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia, surviving repeated ice ages in landscapes that would test even well-equipped modern travellers. Denisovans, known mostly through fragments of bone, teeth, and genetic evidence, ranged across parts of Asia and left DNA in people living today. There were also Homo floresiensis on the Indonesian island of Flores, small-bodied humans with stone tools and a long local history. In the Philippines, Homo luzonensis. In Africa, several human lineages whose exact relationships remain debated. It was not a simple ladder, with one primitive species marching steadily toward us. It was more like a branching, tangled forest. Different human groups appeared, adapted, migrated, mixed, separated, and disappeared. Some were ancestors, some were cousins, some left no living descendants at all. And for long stretches of time, more than one human species shared the planet. That alone should make us cautious about easy stories. Intelligence did not suddenly arrive with the first city wall. It developed gradually in many populations under many conditions over enormous spans of time. A stone tool can look simple when it lies in a museum case. A broken flake of sharp rock, a hand axe, a scraper. But making one requires knowledge. You need to recognize useful stone, locate it in the landscape, understand how it breaks, strike it at the right angle, and shape an edge for a particular job. The earliest known stone tools are more than 3 million years old. They are older than Homo sapiens by a staggering margin. By around 1.7 million years ago, early humans were making hand axes that were often surprisingly symmetrical, carefully shaped on both sides, and used across huge parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. These were not machines, but they were technologies passed from one generation to the next. And technology is not just an object, it is memory. A hand axe contains a lesson. Someone had to learn how to make it. Someone had to watch, imitate, practice, fail, and try again. Perhaps they were shown directly. Perhaps they learned through gestures, sounds, demonstrations, or forms of communication we can no longer reconstruct. Either way, a tool tradition means knowledge was surviving longer than any one person. Fire adds another layer. The evidence for early fire use is complicated. Fires occur naturally, and proving that ancient people controlled one is harder than finding charcoal in the ground. But by hundreds of thousands of years ago, there is strong evidence at some sites that humans were repeatedly using fire. They cooked food. They gathered around heat and light. They may have used fire to alter landscapes, drive animals, harden wooden tools, and make dangerous places more manageable. Think about what a controlled fire changes. It extends the day beyond sunset. It makes colder regions survivable. It transforms food, making some plants easier to digest and some meat safer to eat. It creates a place where people can sit together, work together, and perhaps talk. Not necessarily in language exactly like ours. We cannot hear the voices of those distant people. But fire made social life possible in new ways. Then, much later, the evidence becomes even more intimate. By at least 100,000 years ago, and probably earlier in some forms, Homo sapiens were using pigments such as ochre. Red, yellow and brown earth minerals were collected, ground and carried. Sometimes ochre may have had practical uses, perhaps in adhesives, hide working or insect protection. But it also seems to have had symbolic importance. People marked objects, places, and possibly their own bodies with colour. At Blombos Cave in southern Africa, pieces of ochre from roughly 100,000 years ago bear deliberate engraved lines. They are not writing. We should not force them into becoming a lost alphabet. But they are evidence of intentional pattern making. Someone took a piece of mineral and marked it with a design that did not help cut meat or build a shelter. The mark may have meant something. It may have identified a group, a person, an idea, or a ritual. We do not know, but we know it was not accidental. Shell beads appear at sites in Africa and the eastern Mediterranean more than 70,000 years ago. Some were carried far from the coast where the shells originated. They were pierced, worn, and probably displayed. A bead is a small thing, but it points toward a large idea. People were communicating identity. A necklace can say many things without words. I belong to this group. I have travelled. I have a connection to someone far away. I am mourning. I am celebrating. I am old enough, skilled enough, fortunate enough, or trusted enough to wear this. The exact meanings are lost. The human impulse behind them is not. And people were already moving materials across surprising distances. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges, sometimes travelled dozens or even hundreds of kilometres from its geological source. Particular kinds of stone were selected and carried across landscapes. Marine shells reached inland communities. Pigments moved between regions. These were not global trade networks with warehouses, contracts, and coinage. But they show that small communities were not always isolated. They met, they exchanged, they maintained relationships. This matters because long-distance exchange requires more than walking from one place to another. It depends on trust, memory, social rules, and repeated contact. A valuable stone passed from group to group can carry a story with it. Who found it? Where it came from? Who gave it to whom? What obligation came with the gift? Prehistoric people were not waiting to become social. They already were. They were also capable of remarkable planning. Ice Age hunters understood animal movements, seasons, weather, plant cycles, and the behavior of dangerous prey. People made fitted clothing from hides. They built shelters from wood, bone, skin, and whatever the landscape provided. They crossed open water to reach islands. At different times and in different places, they adapted to deserts, forests, mountains, grasslands, frozen plains, and tropical coasts. None of this means they had cities hidden beneath every hill. That is the important distinction. Sophisticated thought does not automatically produce urban civilization. Intelligence is not a switch that turns on and immediately creates skyscrapers, steam engines, or written laws. A city requires particular conditions: enough reliable food to support large populations, ways to store surplus, systems for organizing labor, stable or repeatedly occupied settlements, and social arrangements capable of managing conflict among thousands of people. Industrial technology requires even more. It needs concentrated energy, specialized knowledge, complex supply chains, large-scale extraction, and generations of accumulated experiment. A brilliant person living in a small mobile group may understand animals, weather, plants, stone, water, and human relationships with astonishing depth. But without mines, furnaces, factories, institutions, and a dense population of specialists, there is no obvious path to engines or electricity. And there is no reason to think every intelligent society would want the same path. For tens of thousands of years, mobile ways of life worked. They could be flexible, resilient, and deeply adapted to local environments. Moving with seasons was not necessarily a failure to settle down. Sometimes it was the best possible strategy. In a changing world, mobility could be wisdom. So prehistory is not an empty gap that demands a lost empire to fill it. It is the long human story, slow, inventive, difficult, creative, and mostly invisible because the people who lived it built with wood, fibre, skin, earth, and memory. They left scattered traces rather than marble capitals. A hearth, a stone blade, a bead, a handprint of pigment, a buried body, a trail of obsidian moving quietly across a continent. And then, as climates shifted and populations grew, some of these old human skills began gathering together in new ways. Settlements became more permanent, ritual places became larger, food gathering became more intensive. The shoreline itself became one of the great stages of this transformation. Except much of that shoreline is now beneath the sea. During the last ice age, the coastlines of the world were not where they are today. They were farther out, sometimes dramatically farther out. At the coldest part of the last glacial period, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked away in enormous ice sheets that global sea level stood roughly 120 meters lower than it does now. That is nearly 400 feet. The difference was not a narrow strip of extra beach. It changed entire maps. Continental shelves that now lie beneath shallow seas were dry land. Broad plains, river valleys, marshes, lakes, forests, grasslands and estuaries stretched outward from the modern coast. Places that are now underwater may once have been among the most attractive places for human beings to live. And that creates a very real problem for archaeology. Human communities are often drawn to coasts. Coasts offer fish, shellfish, birds, marine mammals, fresh water from rivers, sheltered landing places, and routes for travel. A shoreline is where different environments meet. Forest meets beach. River meets sea. Land animals gather near water. Plants grow in wetlands. Food can be abundant and varied. If people were living along those ancient Ice Age coasts, many of their camps, villages, workshops, and burial grounds may now be under tens of meters of water, not hidden by a conspiracy, hidden by the ocean. Take Doggerland. Today the North Sea separates Britain from mainland Europe. But during much of the Ice Age, there was no North Sea as we know it. Britain was connected to the continent by a huge low-lying landscape that stretched between what are now England, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, after Doggerbank, a shallow area of the modern sea floor. Doggerland was not one single kingdom. It was not a lost Atlantis with palaces beneath the waves. It was a landscape, and like any landscape it changed over time. Rivers flowed through it. The ancestors of the Thames, Rhine, and other river systems crossed broad valleys before reaching the distant sea. There were lakes, wetlands, wooded areas, and open grasslands. Herds of animals moved through it. Hunters followed them. People likely gathered plants, fished, made tools, built temporary camps, and returned to familiar places across generations. We know something of this drowned world because the sea occasionally gives pieces of it back. Fishing nets have brought up bones of mammoths, reindeer, deer, and other animals. Dredging operations have recovered stone tools and fragments of ancient landscapes. Sediment cores taken from the sea floor contain pollen grains, preserved plant material, and old river deposits. They reveal that beneath the North Sea is not just featureless mud. It is a buried terrain, a former world, but reconstructing it is difficult. Imagine trying to map an ancient country through a thick blanket while standing on a boat above it, using sound waves, sediment samples, and the occasional object caught in a fishing net. That is, in part, what underwater archaeologists are doing. They use sonar to trace old river channels. They examine seismic survey data gathered for offshore construction and energy projects. They take cores from the seabed. In rare cases, divers investigate submerged sites directly. But water changes the rules on land. An archaeologist can walk slowly across a field, notice a flake of worked stone, open a careful excavation trench, and return season after season. Underwater visibility may be poor, currents can be strong. Sediment can bury a site deeply. Waves and tides can scatter fragile remains. Wood, fibre, leather and bone may decay, while stone tools survive without the context that would explain them. And the ancient shoreline is not always easy to find. Sea level did not rise evenly in every place. The land itself was moving too. In some northern regions, land that had been pressed down by ice sheets began slowly rising after the ice melted. Elsewhere, coastlines sank, rivers shifted, floodplains became estuaries became shallow seas. Doggerland did not disappear in one afternoon, although some local events may have been catastrophic. As the climate warmed after the Ice Age, melting glaciers raised sea levels over thousands of years. Low ground became marsh. Marsh became tidal flat. Tidal flat became sea. Communities could have moved inland gradually, generation by generation, watching familiar hunting grounds shrink and saltwater creep farther up the valleys. Then, around 8,200 years ago, a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway triggered what is called the Storegga tsunami. Waves may have struck parts of the North Sea region, flooding already vulnerable lowlands. It was not the final destruction of an advanced civilization, but for people living near the water, it may have been terrifying. A sudden event layered on top of a slow planetary transformation. Far to the southeast, another immense drowned landscape is known as Sunderland. During periods of low sea level, much of mainland Southeast Asia was connected to the islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and Bali. What is now a maze of seas and islands was once a larger peninsula-like landmass crossed by rivers. The Java Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, and surrounding shallow waters covered plains that were exposed during the Ice Age. Sunderland would have offered rich environments for human populations. Tropical forests, river systems, wetlands, coastal resources and routes between regions that are now separated by water. As seas rose, these lowlands were flooded, breaking one connected landscape into the island world we recognize today. This matters because Southeast Asia has always been central to the human story. People moved through it on their way toward Australia and New Guinea. They adapted to tropical environments, crossed water gaps, and developed local traditions that are still only partly understood. Some early coastal sites may be underwater now, others may have been destroyed by erosion, changing rivers, and repeated shoreline movement. Again, that means missing evidence. It does not mean evidence for a missing global civilization. The Bering Land Bridge tells a similar story from the opposite side of the world. Today, the Bering Strait is a narrow stretch of water between Alaska and Siberia. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, it was dry land. This vast region is often called Beringia. It connected Asia and North America, but it was more than a bridge people simply crossed in a single dramatic migration. For thousands of years, Beringia was a world of its own. Much of it was cold, but not uniformly buried under ice. Parts of it were open grassland and steppe, supporting animals and human groups adapted to the harsh northern environment. The exact routes, timing, and population history of the first peoples in the Americas remain subjects of active research. But Beringia was clearly important. It was a corridor, a refuge, a meeting ground, and eventually, as sea levels rose, a drowned landscape beneath the Bering Strait. The ocean covered not only routes of migration, but possible camps and settlements along those routes. This is why archaeologists are careful when they say the coastal record is incomplete. It is incomplete in a serious way. The earliest people to move along shorelines may have left traces in places we have barely begun to search. Ancient fishing camps may lie beneath bays. Stone tool workshops may rest under estuary sediments. Wooden structures, if sealed in oxygen-poor mud, may survive in rare circumstances. Old footprints, hearths, shell middens and food remains may wait beneath shallow water. Some submerged sites have already been found around the world. They show that underwater archaeology is not fantasy. But finding a site is only the beginning. Dating it, understanding it, and determining whether it was a brief camp, a seasonal gathering place, or a permanent settlement requires evidence that is often damaged or missing. And so there is a reasonable, even likely possibility that important human sites remain undiscovered beneath modern seas. Perhaps some will push back the history of coastal settlement. Perhaps they will reveal early fishing technologies, boats, trade routes, ritual places, or communities more settled than we currently expect. Perhaps they will show that certain regions supported larger populations than the surviving land record suggests. That would be exciting, but it would still not automatically reveal a vanished worldwide civilization with cities, writing machines, and hidden knowledge. A drowned village is not a lost empire. A buried shoreline is not proof of an erased technological age. The real mystery is quieter, and in some ways more moving than the fantasy. Millions of people may have lived along coasts that no longer exist. Their homes were made of materials that decayed, their tools were scattered. Their stories were never written down. Then the sea rose slowly enough for some to flee, quickly enough in certain moments to bring disaster, and completely enough to remove whole landscapes from human memory. The first great archive of human life may not be a library buried in sand. It may be the continental shelf, lying silently beneath the waves. And while the drowned coastlines remind us how much may be missing, some discoveries on dry land remind us how surprising the surviving evidence can be. In southeastern Turkey, on a hill overlooking the plains of Upper Mesopotamia, archaeologists found a place that forced them to rethink one of the oldest stories we tell about civilization. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. Its name means roughly Potbelly Hill. For a long time it looked like little more than a rounded mound in the landscape. But beneath that hill were enormous stone enclosures, built more than 11,000 years ago, around 9,600 BCE, at the beginning of the Neolithic period. That date matters. Göbekli Tepe is older than the pyramids by more than 7,000 years. Older than Stonehenge by around 6,000 years. Older than the first cities of Mesopotamia by many millennia. And yet its builders raised massive carved pillars from limestone. Some of these pillars are shaped like giant T's, the tallest stand over 5 meters high. Some may weigh many tons. They were set in circles or oval enclosures, with 2 larger pillars standing near the centre. Around them, smaller pillars formed walls or rings. The stones were not plain. They were covered with carvings. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, lions, gazelles, animals moving, crouching, twisting across the surfaces of stone. Some pillars also seem to have been given human characteristics. There are carved arms, hands, belts, and cloth-like decorations. The great T-shaped forms may have represented stylized human figures, though exactly what they meant remains uncertain. Picture the work involved. First, someone had to choose the stone, then quarry it from the limestone bedrock nearby, then shape it with stone tools, then move it uphill or across uneven ground, then place it carefully into prepared sockets, then organize enough people to dig, haul, carve, feed one another, and keep returning to the task. This was not the work of one person having an inspired afternoon. It required planning, cooperation, shared purpose. Knowledge passed from one group to another. It may have involved gatherings of people from a wide area, coming together seasonally for ritual, feasting, exchange, or social obligations we can only partly imagine. And that was the surprise. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists often described a simple sequence. First, people settled down and began farming. Farming produced food surpluses. Surpluses supported larger populations. Larger populations developed leaders, temples, monuments, and eventually cities. It was a neat story: plant grain, build village, build temple. Göbekli Tepe made that story harder to maintain. The earliest levels of the site appear to have been built by communities that were still largely hunter-gatherers, or at least living before full-scale farming had taken hold in the region. They hunted wild animals, they gathered wild plants. They were beginning to live in a world where people were experimenting with cultivation and more permanent settlement, but they were not yet farmers in the later, familiar sense. So why build monuments first? Maybe gathering to build and use ceremonial places encouraged people to stay nearby longer. Maybe large feasts created pressure to secure reliable supplies of grain and meat. Maybe repeated gatherings helped turn loose networks of mobile groups into more settled communities. In this view, ritual and cooperation did not simply follow agriculture. They may have helped create the conditions for it. That does not mean Göbekli Tepe was a city. There is no evidence of streets, palaces, writing, metal tools, or a hidden industrial system. Its builders did not leave behind machines or libraries of lost science. The site does not prove that an advanced civilization was destroyed and erased from history. What it shows is both more modest and more astonishing. People without cities were capable of large collective projects. People before writing could preserve complex traditions. People who hunted wild game and gathered plants could still organize labor on a scale once thought impossible without kings, fields, and bureaucracy. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Across southeastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found other early Neolithic sites that reveal a region in transition. At places such as Karahan Tepe, Nevali, Chori, Shayoni, and others, communities built substantial structures, carved stone, developed new ritual practices, and gradually experimented with more settled ways of life. Karahan Tepe, not far from Göbekli Tepe, has revealed more stone pillars and carefully shaped spaces. Nevali Chori produced early communal buildings and carved figures before it was flooded by a modern dam project. Shayoni preserves evidence of changing houses, shared structures, food processing, and the long, uneven movement toward cultivation and domestication. This was not one impossible monument appearing in an empty world. It was part of a wider cultural landscape, a place where different communities were trying new ways of living, gathering, remembering, and organizing themselves. The mystery is real, but it is not necessarily the mystery of a vanished super-civilization. It is the mystery of how ordinary human groups, generation by generation, became capable of doing extraordinary things together. And once people learned that they could gather in large numbers, coordinate labor, store food, mark sacred places, and return to the same ground year after year, another transformation was waiting just beyond the horizon. The first villages were beginning to take root. Once people began returning to the same places, season after season, the landscape started changing around them. At first the changes may have seemed small, a patch of wild grain that was cleared of weeds. Seeds saved from the best harvest and scattered near camp. A herd of animals watched more closely than usual. A storage pit lined with stone or plaster, a house repaired instead of abandoned. Then another house built beside it. Then another. No one woke up one morning and announced that civilization had begun. There was no single inventor of farming, no first king standing in a field, declaring that everyone would now live in villages. What happened was slower, messier, and much more human. Across thousands of years in different parts of the world, people experimented with staying put. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes it created new problems nobody had expected. In the Levant, near a spring in what is now the West Bank, one of the most famous early settlements was taking shape. This was Jericho. People had lived around the oasis long before full farming was established. The spring provided water in a dry region. Wild plants and animals could be found nearby. Over time, the settlement became more permanent. By roughly 9000 BCE, Jericho had substantial round houses made of mud brick. Later phases included more rectangular buildings, a sign that architecture, property, and household life were changing. Jericho is often called one of the world's oldest cities. That description is understandable, but a little misleading. It was not a city in the later Mesopotamian sense. It had no writing, no known palace bureaucracy, no crowds moving through paved streets beneath temple towers. But it was a large, dense, enduring community for its age. Hundreds of people, perhaps more, living in one place, and investing labour in structures meant to last. Most mysterious of all was its stone tower. Built more than 10,000 years ago, the tower stood several metres high beside a substantial wall. Archaeologists still debate its purpose. It may have helped defend the settlement. It may have protected it from floods. It may have carried ritual meaning connected to the surrounding hills, the sun, the dead, or the shared identity of the community. Whatever its purpose, the tower tells us something simple. These people were not merely passing through, they were building a future in one place. And once people settle, they begin accumulating things. Tools, grinding stones, baskets, stores of grain, memories attached to particular houses, burials beneath floors, claims to land, obligations to neighbours. The house becomes more than shelter, it becomes an anchor. That anchor could be comforting. It could also be heavy. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups could move away when a local resource failed, when conflict grew too dangerous, or when waste and disease made a camp unpleasant. A settled community had more to lose. Fields could not walk away. Storage bins could not walk away. Houses, ancestors, and carefully tended animals all tied people to a particular patch of ground. This was the beginning of a great trade. More security, perhaps, in exchange for more work. More food in storage, in exchange for greater risk when harvests failed. More people nearby, in exchange for crowding, conflict, disease, and inequality. Further north in central Anatolia, another remarkable community would show just how dense and complicated village life could become. Its name is Çatalhöyük. Beginning around 7100 BCE, people built a settlement that eventually covered a large mound. The houses were packed tightly together, wall against wall, with few or no streets between them. Instead of entering through ground-level doorways, people often climbed onto rooftops and descended through openings in the ceiling. Imagine a town made of connected rooms, its roofs forming pathways above the homes below. Inside, the houses were carefully maintained. Walls were plastered again and again. Platforms were built for sleeping, working, sitting, and perhaps ritual activity. Many dead were buried beneath floors or platforms, placing ancestors directly inside the domestic world of the living. Some rooms contained paintings, animal horns, sculpted features, and elaborate decoration. These discoveries have encouraged many interpretations. Perhaps certain houses held special status. Perhaps rituals were woven into ordinary family life. Perhaps the buildings preserved memories of lineage, household, hunting traditions, or community identity. But the evidence does not point clearly to palaces or a class of all-powerful rulers. Çatalhöyük seems, at least in its earlier phases, to have been a dense community without the obvious monumental hierarchy seen in later states. Houses were often broadly similar in size. Daily life may have been organized through households, kin groups, shared customs, and local obligations rather than through kings and officials. That matters because it reminds us that large communities could take many forms. There was no fixed blueprint. Some villages emphasized communal buildings. Some centered on households. Some gathered around springs, rivers, or fertile plains. Some grew quickly and then shrank. Others lasted for centuries, changing so gradually that one generation may barely have noticed how different its world had become from that of its grandparents. Farming itself was not a sudden switch. In Southwest Asia, people gradually cultivated wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and other plants. They began managing sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. At first, these animals may have been hunted, then protected, then selectively controlled, and eventually bred in ways that changed both the animals and the humans who depended on them. The same broad process happened elsewhere, independently and differently. In China, communities cultivated millet in the north and rice in wetter southern regions. In New Guinea, people developed intensive plant cultivation in highland valleys. In Mesoamerica, people slowly transformed wild plants over many generations, eventually producing crops such as maize, beans, and squash. In the Andes, potatoes, quinoa, llamas, and alpacas became part of other long experiments in food and settlement. There was no single agricultural revolution sweeping outward like a command. There were many revolutions unfolding at different speeds. And farming did more than produce food, it changed time itself. A hunter could respond to what was available today. A farmer had to think months ahead. When should seeds be planted? Which grain should be saved rather than eaten? How much food must remain for winter? Who guards the stores? Who repairs the walls? Who cares for animals? Who inherits a field after someone dies? These questions created new kinds of social pressure. Food storage made survival more reliable in good years, but it also made surplus visible. And when surplus becomes visible, so does power. Someone may control access to grain. Someone may organize labor. Someone may become known as especially skilled at ritual, trade, herding, building, healing, or settling disputes. Crafts began to become more specialized too. Not everyone had to spend every hour finding food. Some people could make finer stone blades, weave cloth, shape pottery, work bone, produce ornaments, or travel to obtain obsidian, shells, pigments, and other valued materials. Village life was becoming an experiment in cooperation on a new scale. Not yet civilization in the familiar sense, not yet cities, but no longer the older world of small, mobile bands either. And archaeology lets us watch the experiment unfolding. Layer by layer, beneath the mounds of ancient settlements, one generation built on the remains of another. A house was abandoned, filled in, and rebuilt. A storage practice changed. Animal bones became younger and more uniform, hinting at herd management. Seeds grew larger, suggesting cultivation and selection. Imported materials appeared, revealing exchange networks stretching far beyond the horizon. The evidence does not show a lost advanced world suddenly vanishing beneath the soil. It shows something more gradual, human beings learning, failing, adapting, and trying again. Fields became villages. Villages became larger settlements. Larger settlements created problems that demanded new solutions. And eventually, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, those solutions would produce something unmistakably new. The city in southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the experiment became larger than ever before. This was a difficult landscape to live in. The rivers brought water, fertile mud, fish, reeds, and routes for travel. But they also flooded unpredictably. In some places the land was marshy. In others it was dry and exposed. Rainfall in the far south was too limited for dependable farming. If people wanted large harvests, they had to move water themselves. So they dug canals. At first, perhaps they were modest channels, guiding river water toward nearby fields. But canals need maintenance. Their banks collapse. Silt fills them. Water has to be shared, redirected, watched. A canal system links one household to another, one field to another, one season to the next. And once hundreds, then thousands of people depended on that system, cooperation was no longer optional. Someone had to organize the work. Long before the famous cities of Sumer, villages had already existed in this region for millennia. Archaeologists call some of the early southern Mesopotamian cultures Ubaid, after a site where their distinctive pottery was first identified. Beginning around 6500 BCE, communities built mud brick houses, farmed, herded animals, fished, and exchanged goods across wide distances. They were not strangers appearing from nowhere. They were the descendants of earlier village worlds, adapting to the particular opportunities of the river plain. Over time, some settlements grew larger, their buildings became more varied. Public structures appeared, temples rose on platforms, rebuilt again and again as generations covered old walls with new ones. The mound that formed beneath a city was not usually the remains of one dramatic lost age. It was a stack of ordinary lives. Houses, ovens, broken pots, burials, drains, workshops, storerooms. One century pressed quietly into another. Then, by around 4000 BCE, something extraordinary was happening around the settlement we call Uruk. Uruk was becoming a city, not simply a large village. A city in the fuller sense, a place with dense population, monumental religious buildings, specialized labor, long-distance trade, administrators, social ranks, and eventually writing. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk may have held tens of thousands of people. Exact numbers are difficult to know, because ancient cities changed constantly and population estimates are never perfectly certain. But there is no doubt that it was immense by the standards of its time. Imagine the pressures of such a place. Grain had to arrive from fields beyond the walls. Herds had to be counted. Workers had to be fed. Bricks had to be made. Canals had to be cleared. Goods had to be stored and moved. Disputes had to be settled. Temples had to receive offerings. Labour gangs had to know where they were needed. A small village can often remember these things through conversation. A city cannot. And this is where Mesopotamia gives us one of the clearest windows into the beginning of complex civilization. The temple stood near the centre of this new world. It was not just a place for private prayer. In many Mesopotamian cities, temples were economic institutions. They held land, received grain, managed herds, employed workers, and organized rituals that connected the community to its gods. The people of Sumer believed their cities belonged in a sense to divine beings. The god or goddess was the true owner. Human rulers, priests, labourers and farmers served within that sacred order. That belief gave power a cosmic shape. If the fields produced grain, if canals brought water, if traders returned safely, then the gods had been honoured. If famine, flood or war arrived, people searched for what had gone wrong. But beneath the sacred language was a very practical system of administration. Clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia. Fine river mud could be shaped into bricks, jars, seals, and small tablets. At first, people used clay tokens and sealings to track goods: sheep, jars of oil, baskets of grain, quantities of cloth. Then marks began to be pressed into clay itself. Around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, in and around Uruk. These marks developed into the earliest known writing system. The first texts were not poems, prophecies, or heroic adventures. They were accounts, lists of grain, lists of workers, lists of animals and deliveries. The beginning of writing was, in part, the beginning of bureaucracy. Civilization, it turns out, did not first write down a love song. It wrote down who owed barley. Later, Mesopotamian scribes would record hymns, laws, letters, school exercises, royal inscriptions, medical recipes, astronomical observations, arguments, jokes, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the earliest tablets preserve something almost more intimate, the daily machinery of a growing city. And clay preserved it unusually well. Papyrus rots, leather decays, wood burns or disappears. But a clay tablet, once dried in the sun, can survive for thousands of years. If fire later sweeps through a building, it may bake the tablets hard enough to preserve them even better. This is why Mesopotamia can seem suddenly crowded with voices. Not because earlier people had no thoughts, no trade, no rituals, no systems of knowledge, but because southern Mesopotamia happened to use a material that endured. Thousands upon thousands of tablets survived in ruined rooms, temple archives, palaces, schools, and garbage deposits. They give us names, numbers, contracts, complaints, and tiny fragments of lives that would otherwise be silent. They also reveal hierarchy. Some people controlled land and labour. Some worked as farmers, herders, fishers, weavers, potters, boatmen, builders, and soldiers. Some were enslaved or otherwise unfree. Some served temples. Some held positions of authority. Kings emerged, though their power varied across periods and cities. Wealth was unevenly distributed. Grandeur for a few rested on the organized work of many. The city was an achievement. It was also a machine for concentrating power. And that is part of its strange appeal. When people imagine a civilization before Sumer, they often imagine an even older city hidden beneath the sands, wiser, more advanced, perhaps erased by flood or catastrophe. Mesopotamia seems like a natural place to search. It has ancient rivers, buried mounds, flood stories, and cities so old that even later Mesopotamians considered them unimaginably ancient. But the evidence we have points in a different direction. Uruk did not appear fully formed one morning, with writing, temples, kings, and markets already in place. Beneath its later levels are earlier settlements. Before those are earlier village traditions. The city grew from experiments in farming, irrigation, exchange, ritual and administration that had been developing for centuries. There are gaps in the record, of course. River channels shifted. Some ancient settlements may lie buried beneath later towns, marshes, or deep layers of alluvium. Archaeology never sees everything. But a missing layer is not automatically a missing civilization. For a civilization before Sumer to be established, we would need more than a story, a flood legend, or an intriguing mound. We would need settlements, tools, burials, production sites, inscriptions or unmistakable administrative systems, and evidence that fits into a clear archaeological sequence. So far, southern Mesopotamia tells a more gradual story. Not the story of a vanished super-civilization, the story of villages becoming towns, towns becoming cities, and cities leaving behind baked clay proof of how it happened. And yet, when people look at the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, they keep returning to one image. Water rising over the plain, a river leaving its banks. Mud brick walls dissolving, storehouses ruined, fields swallowed, families climbing to rooftops, loading what they can onto boats, waiting for the water to fall. For people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, this was not an abstract fear. Flooding was part of life. The rivers could bring fertile silt, but they could also change course, break through embankments, destroy crops, and turn a prosperous settlement into a landscape of mud and wreckage. So it is not surprising that Mesopotamia produced some of the oldest flood stories ever written down. The most famous appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, the king searching for a way to escape death, meets a man named Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim tells him that the gods once decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. But one god, Ea, secretly warned him. He was told to build a huge boat, bring aboard his family, animals, craftsmen, and supplies, and seal himself inside. Then the storm came. For days, the world was overwhelmed. Even the gods in the story were frightened by the destruction they had unleashed. Eventually, the waters receded. Utnapishtim released birds to search for land. First a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven that did not return. The boat came to rest on a mountain. A sacrifice was offered. The gods gathered around it. If parts of that sound familiar, they should. Later flood narratives from the Hebrew Bible, especially the story of Noah, share striking elements: divine warning, a chosen survivor, a great vessel, animals preserved from destruction, birds released over the waters, and a sacrifice after land appears again. But the Gilgamesh version was not the first Mesopotamian telling. An older Akkadian story, known as Atrahasis, also describes the gods sending a flood. In that version, humanity has become too noisy and troublesome for the divine powers. The god Enlil wants them gone. Ea warns the human hero, Atrahasis, who builds a boat and survives. And before Atrahasis, there was probably an even earlier Sumerian tradition involving a flood survivor called Ziusudra. These stories changed as they moved through time. Names changed. Gods changed. The reasons for the flood changed. In one version, humanity is too loud. In another, the flood is tied to divine judgment. In another, the story becomes part of a king's search for immortality. That is what stories do. They travel, they adapt, They absorb the concerns of the people telling them. This does not mean every flood tradition on Earth is a direct memory of one single event. Flood stories appear in many cultures. There are flood traditions in Greece, India, China, the Pacific Islands, the Americas, and elsewhere. Some involve angry gods, some involve ancestors, some describe a canoe, a mountain, an animal helper, or a small group of survivors. But the details are often profoundly different. A shared theme is not the same thing as shared testimony. People everywhere tend to live near water. Rivers, lakes, coasts, and wetlands provide food, transport, fertile soil, and trade routes. They also flood. A community does not need knowledge of Mesopotamia to remember a river catastrophe. It only needs to have watched its own world disappear beneath water. And catastrophic floods can be very local, while still feeling universal to those who survive them. A river may shift across a floodplain and erase villages. A dam of ice or landslide debris may burst upstream. A cyclone can push seawater far inland. A tsunami can arrive with almost no warning, lifting boats into trees and scattering homes across miles of coast. Then there is the slower kind of flood. After the last ice age, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters as vast ice sheets melted. This did not happen in one sudden worldwide wave. It unfolded over thousands of years, though some periods may have included faster pulses of sea level rise. Coastlines moved inward. Low plains disappeared. Estuaries changed shape. Islands became islands for communities living on those ancient shores. The loss would have been real. Hunting grounds, campsites, freshwater sources, and burial places could vanish beneath the sea over generations. This is one reason drowned landscapes matter so much. Beneath modern waters lie places where people once lived. But drowned coastlines are not evidence, by themselves, of a lost global civilization. Most were home to small communities whose traces are difficult to find, not because someone removed them, but because waves, sediment, currents, and rising seas are extremely effective at breaking things apart. If you enjoy these mysteries, the channel's book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website, with the link in the description. The flood stories remain powerful because they are about more than water. They are about fragility, about the feeling that the ordinary world can end overnight, about the small number of people who survive when everything familiar is gone, and about the difficult question that comes afterward. What do you save? Seeds, animals, tools, children, names, stories? Maybe that is why flood narratives endure. They turn disaster into memory, and memory into a warning. They tell people that the world has been broken before, that survival is possible but never guaranteed. And for those searching for a lost world, they offer an irresistible possibility. Perhaps the story is not only symbolic, perhaps it remembers something real, sometimes. It probably does. But real does not always mean worldwide, and ancient does not automatically mean advanced. And ancient does not automatically mean advanced. That matters especially when we turn toward Egypt. Few places on Earth create a stronger feeling of impossible age. The pyramids rise from the desert with a kind of confidence that can seem almost unnatural. They are vast, precise, and still standing after more than 4,000 years. Their stone blocks are heavier than cars. Their internal passages align with deliberate purpose. Their builders left monuments so durable that later civilizations found them ancient. It is easy to stand before the Great Pyramid and think, surely ordinary people, using copper tools, wood, rope, stone hammers, and human strength, could not have done this. And from that thought, a whole universe of claims opens up. Lost machines, secret energy devices, visitors from another world. a vanished civilization that taught Egypt everything it knew. Evidence removed by priests, kings, archaeologists, or governments determined to protect the official story. But Egypt's actual history is more gradual, more human, and in many ways more astonishing than the myth. The civilization of the pharaohs did not appear suddenly beside the Nile with pyramids already planned. Before the great dynasties, there were pre-dynastic communities. For thousands of years, people along the Nile Valley farmed, herded animals, fished, hunted, traded, buried their dead, and developed local traditions of pottery, jewellery, stoneworking, and ritual. The Nile made this possible, though never effortless. Its annual flood deposited fertile silt across narrow strips of land bordered by desert. Communities learned when to plant, when to harvest, how to store grain, and how to organize labor around a seasonal river. Over time, villages grew into regional centers. Some groups became wealthier and more powerful than others. Graves became more elaborate. Symbols of authority appeared. Trade brought materials from far beyond the Nile Valley: gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from regions far to the east. By around 3100 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt had been brought together under a single kingship, at least in the political language of the earliest dynasties. The famous Narmer palette, with its images of conquest and royal power, is not a complete account of unification. It is a ceremonial object, probably designed to make a political claim. But it shows something important. Egypt was already developing a state capable of using images, ritual, taxation, administration, and force to hold a large territory together. Then came centuries of experimentation. Royal tombs became larger. Mud brick structures gave way, in certain sacred and funerary settings, to stone. Officials developed systems for managing grain, land, labour, and goods. Scribes recorded deliveries, personnel, and supplies. Kings gathered enough wealth and authority to command projects beyond the reach of a single village or household. The pyramids emerged from this long process. The first great stone pyramid, built for King Djoser around 2650 BCE, did not begin as a pyramid at all. It grew from the older mastaba tomb, a flat rectangular structure with sloping sides. At Saqqara, builders placed one mastaba upon another, creating a stepped monument unlike anything Egypt had seen before. Its architect is traditionally identified as Imhotep, a high official later remembered with such admiration that he was eventually honoured almost like a god. Whether every detail of the design came from one individual is impossible to know. Massive projects are rarely the work of one mind, but the step pyramid shows Egyptian builders learning in public on a monumental scale. They were testing stone construction, and the tests did not always go perfectly. The next generations built several pyramids for King Sneferu. At Meidum, a pyramid seems to have suffered a major collapse, either during construction or later. The bent pyramid changes angle part way up, probably because its original slope created dangerous structural pressures. Nearby, the red pyramid used a safer angle and became the first successful true pyramid, with smooth sides. This is not the pattern we would expect if Egyptians had simply inherited flawless plans from a lost technological civilization. It is the pattern of engineers learning from mistakes. Then, around 2550 BCE, Sneferu's son Khufu built the Great Pyramid at Giza. It is enormous. Originally about 146 meters high, it remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth for roughly 3,800 years. Its core contains millions of limestone blocks, while heavier granite was used in internal chambers and structural spaces. The project required planning on a scale that still impresses engineers. But impressive is not the same as inexplicable. the Egyptians had access to the materials needed for such work. Copper chisels and drills could be used on softer stone, while harder stones could be shaped with pounders made from dolerite, an extremely tough rock. Sand mixed with water could act as an abrasive for cutting and smoothing. Wood, rope, sledges, levers, boats, ramps, and large coordinated workforces could move extraordinary loads without requiring machines unknown to archaeology. We do not possess a single ancient Egyptian instruction manual titled How to Build a Pyramid. That absence is real, but absence is not proof of secret technology. We have quarries, we have stone tools, we have unfinished monuments that reveal methods and mistakes. We have workers' settlements near Giza, including bakeries, animal bones, sleeping areas, and evidence of organized food distribution. We have cemeteries of workers. We have inscriptions left by labor crews, including teams with names like Friends of Khufu, and we have one especially valuable document, the Diary of Mera. Mera was an official who recorded the movements of a work crew during Khufu's reign. His papyrus notes describe transporting limestone by boat along canals and branches of the Nile toward the Giza construction site. It is not a complete blueprint for the pyramid, but it is a rare administrative voice from inside the system that made the pyramid possible. It tells us something simple and powerful. Stone moved through an organized landscape. Quarries were connected to river transport. Laborers were supplied with food. Crews had supervisors. The state could mobilize people seasonally, perhaps especially when agricultural work was limited by the Nile flood. These were not necessarily enslaved masses driven endlessly by whips, as old movies often imagine. The evidence points more toward a complex workforce: skilled specialists, rotating labor crews, administrators, craftspeople, and people supported by a centralized economy. How exactly were the blocks raised? That remains a genuine question. Ramps are the leading explanation, but there may not have been one single ramp design. Straight ramps, zigzagging ramps, side ramps, internal ramps, levers, and combinations of methods have all been proposed. Archaeologists have found evidence for ramp systems at some Egyptian sites, though not a final answer for every stage of pyramid construction at Giza. Experimental archaeology has shown that small teams can drag heavy stone blocks on sledges, especially when sand is dampened to reduce friction. It has shown that simple tools can perform tasks that appear impossible at first glance. But experiments also have limits. Reproducing one block movement is not the same as reconstructing decades of construction. Thousands of workers, changing political conditions, supply failures, injuries, weather, and decisions made by ancient foremen. The mystery is not gone. It has simply become more precise. Egyptian surveying is another source of wonder. The Great Pyramid is closely aligned to the cardinal directions. Its base is remarkably level. Achieving this did not require lasers or satellites. Ancient builders could observe the stars, use sighting instruments, measure shadows, stretch cords, and establish level lines with water. The exact procedures remain debated, but the principles are within the reach of careful observation and repeated measurement. That is the part people sometimes underestimate. Human beings do not need modern electronics to be clever. They need time, practice, institutions, and a reason to keep knowledge alive. Egypt had all four. Its monuments were not messages from an impossible past. They were evidence of what a river civilization could accomplish when kings concentrated resources, when skilled workers passed techniques across generations, and when religious belief made building for the dead seem worth an enormous investment of the living. Still, questions remain. We do not know every logistical detail. We cannot name every worker. We cannot fully reconstruct the conversations in the planning offices. the arguments over damaged stone, or the countless small innovations that never made it into writing. But uncertainty should make us more careful, not more certain that the answer must be hidden. Because Egypt does not show us a civilization appearing from nowhere. It shows us something more believable and perhaps more remarkable. Knowledge accumulating slowly, one quarry, one boatload, one measurement, one generation at a time. Across the Arabian Sea and beyond the deserts of Iran, another great Bronze Age civilization was taking shape. It did not build pyramids. It did not leave giant royal statues with names carved across their chests. Its rulers, if they had rulers in the familiar sense, did not fill its surviving monuments with victories, family trees, or claims to divine power. And yet, for centuries, it was one of the largest urban worlds on Earth. This was the Indus civilization, often called the Indus Valley civilization or the Harappan civilization, after the site of Harappa in what is now Pakistan. At its height, roughly between 2600 and 1900 BCE, it stretched across an enormous area. Its settlements reached from the highlands near Afghanistan, through the plains of modern Pakistan and northwestern India, and toward the coast of the Arabian Sea. More than 1,000 sites have been identified, although many were villages, seasonal settlements, or small towns rather than cities. Two places became especially famous, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro, whose modern name means Mound of the Dead, stood beside the Indus River in present-day Sindh. Harappa lay hundreds of miles to the north, near a branch of the river system that has changed course many times since antiquity. Neither was isolated. They were part of a broad network of settlements linked by shared building practices, craft traditions, measurements, and symbols. When archaeologists began uncovering these cities in the early 20th century, the scale was startling. Their streets were often laid out in orderly patterns. Buildings used standardized baked bricks, commonly made in a consistent proportion. Houses opened onto lanes and courtyards. Many had wells, bathing areas and drains, leading into covered channels beneath the streets. The drainage systems are the detail people remember, and for good reason. Water management was built into everyday urban life. Wastewater could flow through brick-lined drains. Inspection holes allowed parts of the system to be cleaned. Individual homes connected to larger channels. Not every house was identical, and not every part of every city was equally well served. But the overall pattern suggests planning, maintenance, and shared expectations about how a city should function. It was not glamorous in the way a pyramid is glamorous. It was practical, and practicality spread across a city of tens of thousands of people is its own kind of monument. The Indus people also used standardized weights, often small stone cubes made to carefully controlled units. These appear across a huge territory, suggesting that merchants, artisans, and officials could rely on common measures. That matters because trade depends on trust. If a weight means one thing in Harappa and another thing hundreds of miles away, every transaction becomes an argument. Standard weights turn distance into something manageable. The civilization produced fine pottery, copper and bronze tools, shell ornaments, carved stone terracotta figurines, and some of the most delicate beads of the ancient world. Carnelian beads, heated and drilled with remarkable care, travelled far beyond the Indus region. Mesopotamian texts mention a distant place called Meluha, widely believed by many scholars to refer to the Indus world. Goods, people, and ideas moved between these regions by sea and overland routes. So this was not a hidden civilization waiting to be discovered by modern imagination. It was a documented part of the Bronze Age world, but it still holds one of history's most frustrating mysteries. The Indus people wrote, or at least they used a system of signs that looks very much like writing. These signs appear on seals, pottery, small tablets, tools, and other objects. A typical inscription is brief, sometimes only a few symbols long. There may be hundreds of distinct signs, though scholars disagree about the exact number and about how the system was organized. Some inscriptions seem to run from right to left, others may have been arranged differently. The problem is that nobody has deciphered them. There is no Indus equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, no long bilingual inscription giving the same message in a known language and an unknown one. There are no surviving libraries of Indus texts, no royal annals, no legal codes, no personal letters explaining what the people called themselves, what language they spoke, or how they organized political power. This leaves important questions open. Were the symbols recording a Dravidian language, as one major theory suggests? Were they connected to another lost language family? Were they a full writing system, a limited administrative notation, or something in between? What did the seals identify? Merchants, clans, offices, religious groups, shipments of goods? We do not know, but this is where a real mystery can become distorted. An undeciphered civilization is not an unknowable civilization, and it is not an erased civilization. We know its cities existed because their bricks remain. We know its people managed water because their drains remain. We know they measured goods because their weights remain. We know they traded because their materials, workshops, and foreign connections remain. We know they made choices about urban life that were repeated over vast distances. What we lack is their own extended voice. That loss is painful, but it is not necessarily suspicious. Writing was often made on materials that decay: wood, cloth, bark, palm leaves, leather, wax, and other surfaces that rarely survive for 4,000 years in hot, wet, shifting landscapes. Even clay tablets, which survived so well in Mesopotamia, were not the preferred medium everywhere, and only a fraction of Indus sites have been excavated. Mohenjo-Daro itself is threatened by salt, erosion, and a high water table. Modern cities, farms, roads, and changing rivers cover or damage ancient ground. Some archives may never have existed, others may still be buried. Others may have dissolved into soil long before anyone knew to look. That is the quieter truth. History is full of missing pages. Not because someone always removed them, but because time is very good at destroying paper, wood, memory, and ordinary things. The Indus civilization does not prove that a forgotten super-civilization came before all others. It proves something more useful. A great civilization can be plainly visible in its streets, its drains, its workshops, and its trade routes, while still keeping its deepest conversations just beyond our reach. And if the Indus world reminds us that cities can survive without readable texts, early China shows us something equally important. Civilization did not appear once in one sacred valley, then spread across the planet unchanged like a torch passed from hand to hand. Human societies were connected. Ideas, crops, metals, animals, and techniques moved across astonishing distances. But connection is not the same thing as copying. Different regions were solving similar problems in their own ways, using local rivers, local climates, local materials, and local traditions. In East Asia, the Yellow River Basin became one of the great centers of this long experiment. The Yellow River is powerful, unpredictable, and heavily burdened with fine yellow sediment called loess. It has nourished farming communities for thousands of years, but it has also flooded, shifted course, and destroyed settlements with terrifying force. Living beside it required patience, cooperation, and a willingness to rebuild. Long before dynasties, there were villages. By roughly 5000 BCE, Neolithic communities in northern China were growing millet, raising pigs and dogs, making pottery, and living in settled or semi-settled villages. The Yangshao cultures spread across parts of the Yellow River region, are known for painted pottery, communal settlements, and increasingly complex craft traditions. Later came the Longshan cultures, beginning around 3000 BCE. Their pottery could be thin, dark, and polished almost to a metallic shine. Some settlements were surrounded by walls made from pounded earth, a technique called rammed earth. These walls suggest that people were beginning to organize labour on a larger scale, and perhaps beginning to worry more seriously about conflict. But even this description can be misleading if it makes China sound like one neat line moving toward one inevitable result. It was never one line across what is now China. Different societies were developing in different landscapes. Rice farmers lived in the wetter south. Communities near the coast worked jade and navigated river systems. In the lower Yangtze region, the Liangzhu culture built large settlements, earthworks, canals, and elite burial grounds filled with beautifully carved jade objects. In the northeast, along the Middle Yellow River, and in the western highlands other cultures followed their own paths. Some rose, some merged, some disappeared. The story was not civilization arriving from outside. It was many human communities experimenting, competing, trading, borrowing, and changing over thousands of years. Then, around 1900 BCE, a site called Erlitou emerged in the Central Plains near the Yellow River. Erlitou is one of the most important and most debated places in Chinese archaeology. It had large palatial buildings, planned roads, workshops, elite burials, and evidence of bronze production. Its people were no longer living in small, loosely organized villages. This was a society with hierarchy, specialized crafts, organized labor, and enough political power to direct resources toward major construction projects. Many Chinese scholars associate Erlitou with the Jie dynasty, the first dynasty described in much later traditional histories. But the evidence is not simple. No excavated text from Erlitou clearly says, "This is Ya." The historical tradition may preserve real memories of early states, but matching an archaeological site to a named dynasty remains an interpretation, not a settled fact. Still, whether or not Erlitou was Jia, it shows that an early state-level society had formed in the region. And from this world came the Shang. By around 1600 BCE, the Shang dynasty was ruling parts of northern China. At its later capital near modern Anyang, archaeology becomes startlingly detailed. Here there were royal tombs, monumental buildings, workshops, chariots, weapons, and bronze vessels made with extraordinary technical skill. Shang bronze was not simply melted metal poured into a simple mould. Craftworkers used complex piece mould casting. They created clay moulds in sections, assembled them around a core, and poured molten bronze into the space between. This allowed them to make vessels with sharp designs, animal masks, spirals, and raised patterns that seem almost alive in the firelight. These bronzes were tools of ceremony, power, and memory. They were also expensive. Copper, tin, lead, fuel, labour, and trained specialists had to be gathered and organised. Every large vessel tells us that a political system existed behind it, one capable of moving materials and commanding skilled work. Then there are the oracle bones. These were usually cattle shoulder blades or turtle shells. Shang diviners carved questions into them. Would it rain? Should the king go hunting? Would a campaign succeed? Was an ancestor displeased? Heat was applied until the bone cracked, and the cracks were interpreted as answers. The questions, and sometimes the outcomes, were carved into the surface. This is the earliest securely known Chinese writing. Unlike the short signs of the Indus civilization, Shang oracle bone inscriptions can be read. They record royal names, rituals, warfare, harvests, illnesses, sacrifices, and anxieties. They do not tell us everything. Most writing from the Shang court probably vanished long ago. But they let us hear a Bronze Age state thinking aloud, asking the dead and the gods what tomorrow might bring. And yet, even the Shang were not all of ancient China. Beyond their political centres were other communities with their own burial customs, metal traditions, artistic styles, and forms of authority. Some traded with Shang rulers, some fought them. Some may have been absorbed into expanding states. Others remained outside their reach. This is the larger lesson. Civilization is not a single invention with one birthplace and one authorized version. Cities, writing, kingship, monuments, farming, trade, and social hierarchy appeared in different combinations at different times, across different regions. Sometimes people learned from neighbours. Sometimes they reinvented solutions because the same pressures produced similar answers. And sometimes the evidence still leaves us unsure which happened first. East Asia does not need to be forced into a Mediterranean story to matter. It broadens the whole investigation. It shows us that the ancient world was not one road leading outward from one origin. It was a landscape of many roads crossing, separating, and sometimes vanishing beneath the dust. And if East Asia shows us many roads through the ancient world, the Americas show us something even more important. A civilization does not need to resemble Egypt, Mesopotamia, or China in order to be real. For a very long time, many people told the history of the Americas as if it began late and only became interesting when Europeans arrived. Before that, according to the old story, there were scattered tribes, simple villages, and an empty continent waiting for history. Archaeology has spent more than a century dismantling that story. Humans had been living in the Americas for at least 15,000 years, and perhaps earlier. The exact dates and routes are still debated. Some ancestors likely entered through Beringia, the broad land region that once connected Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age. Others may have followed coastlines, travelling along shores that are now drowned beneath the sea. However they arrived, they entered continents of enormous variety. There were tundras and forests, deserts and grasslands, tropical rivers, high mountain valleys, coastal marshes and islands scattered across warm blue seas. No single way of life could work everywhere, so people adapted. They hunted large animals, gathered wild plants, fished rivers and oceans, managed landscapes with fire, and learned the habits of thousands of local species. Over generations, knowledge accumulated which routes were safe, when fish ran upstream, where rainfall gathered after a dry season, how to grow food in shallow soil, flooded lowlands, mountain terraces, or desert basins. Agriculture emerged independently in several regions. In Mesoamerica, people gradually transformed a wild grass called teosinte into maize. They cultivated beans, squash, chili peppers, avocados, cacao, and many other crops. In the Andes, communities domesticated potatoes, quinoa, llamas, alpacas, and other species suited to high, cold landscapes. This was not one sudden agricultural revolution. It was a long relationship between people, plants, animals, soil, water, and time. And from those relationships came villages, then ceremonial centres, then cities on the dry coast of present-day Peru. One of the earliest remarkable examples is Caral, part of the wider Norte Chico, or Caral Supe tradition. By around 3000 BCE, while the first cities of Mesopotamia were still taking shape, people in this region were building large platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and carefully planned settlements. Caral did not look like a Sumerian city. It had no known writing system, no giant stone walls, and no obvious royal tombs filled with weapons. But it organized labor on a massive scale. People moved stone, shaped public spaces, grew crops in river valleys, and relied on fishing communities along the coast. Its builders created a civilization fitted to their own world: dry valleys, seasonal rivers, and the astonishingly productive Pacific Ocean. Further north, in Mesoamerica, another tradition emerged around 1500 BCE. The Olmec world developed along the humid Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico. Here were fertile floodplains, dense forests and rivers that connected communities across the landscape. At sites such as San Lorenzo and La Venta, the Olmec built raised platforms, plazas, drainage systems and ceremonial complexes. They are famous for their colossal stone heads, some weighing many tons. The stone often came from distant volcanic highlands. Moving it required planning, labour, and coordination. But the heads are not evidence of visitors from another continent, lost giants, or forgotten super-technologies. They are evidence of human beings doing difficult things together, with local knowledge, local materials, and local systems of power. The Olmec were not the mysterious mother civilization of everything that followed. That old phrase makes the past too simple, but they were deeply influential. Their imagery, ritual practices, and exchange networks formed part of a larger Mesoamerican conversation that continued for centuries. Then came the Maya. Across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, Maya societies developed in forests, limestone uplands, wetlands, and dry seasonal plains. There was never one Maya empire ruling all Maya people. There were many city-states, alliances, rivalries, dynasties, and local traditions. Cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul, Copan, and Caracol built temples, palaces, reservoirs, causeways, and plazas. Maya scribes created one of the most detailed writing systems in the ancient Americas. Their inscriptions recorded rulers, wars, marriages, rituals, births, defeats, and political claims. They also studied the sky with extraordinary care. Maya astronomy was not merely abstract curiosity. Calendars helped organize ritual life, farming cycles, royal ceremonies, and historical memory. Their calculations tracked the movements of the Sun, Moon, Venus, and other visible bodies with remarkable precision. In central Mexico, Teotihuacan rose around the 1st century CE. At its height, it may have held more than 100,000 people, perhaps far more. It was one of the largest cities on Earth. Its broad avenue of the dead, massive pyramids, apartment compounds, workshops, murals, and markets reveal a planned urban world of enormous complexity. But even here, the evidence leaves questions. We do not fully know what language its people spoke, how their rulers governed, or why the city eventually declined. That uncertainty is not a gap waiting to be filled by fantasy. It is a reminder that ancient people do not owe us complete explanations. Across the Americas, other societies were building in their own ways. Javin ritual centers in the Andes, Moche cities and irrigation systems on Peru's northern coast, Hohokam canal networks in the desert southwest, Mississippian mound centers such as Cahokia near the Mississippi River. Different climates, different crops, different political systems, different visions of the sacred. The old claim that these achievements required civilizing visitors from Egypt, Atlantis, Europe, or some vanished master race does not survive the evidence. It usually begins by looking at a pyramid, a calendar, or a great earthwork and saying, no indigenous people could have made this alone. But they did. Not alone as isolated individuals, of course. No civilization is built alone. They built through generations of shared knowledge, cooperation, conflict, observation, memory, and work. The Americas were never an empty chapter before contact. They were a continent of experiments in living, urban, agricultural, astronomical, architectural, spiritual, and political, and recognizing that does more than correct the record. It changes the question beneath the ruins. Instead of asking who taught these people to become civilized, we can ask the better question. What did they know about their own worlds that allowed them to create civilizations unlike any other on Earth? And that question leads us toward one of the most powerful ideas in all of history. What if there was another civilization before the ones we know? Not just another city, another kingdom, another tradition with a different script or unfamiliar gods. What if there was a whole continent, a place of immense cities, advanced knowledge, towering temples, and people who understood the secrets of the world long before Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Maya, or China? A place that disappeared beneath the sea. For more than 2,000 years, that place has had a name: Atlantis. The story comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, writing around 360 BCE. It appears in two dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. In them, Plato describes an island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis, he says, was large, wealthy, and powerful. Its people had fertile land, impressive buildings, ships, armies, and a magnificent capital arranged in rings of land and water. They had become ambitious. They wanted more territory, more power, more control. Then they attacked Athens. In Plato's story, ancient Athens resisted them. The Athenians defeated this overwhelming enemy, preserving freedom against imperial conquest. But soon afterward, earthquakes and floods struck. In a single terrible day and night, Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. It is an unforgettable story, a golden civilization swallowed by water, a warning preserved in fragments, a whole world gone so completely that later people could only wonder where it had been. But there is a problem. Plato is our only ancient source for Atlantis. No Egyptian inscription has been found describing it. No Greek record outside Plato confirms it. No archaeological site has been identified as its capital. And Plato was not writing a modern history book. He was a philosopher. His dialogues often use stories to explore morality, politics, justice, and the dangers of human pride. Atlantis may have been a political lesson. The island power is rich, aggressive, and corrupt. Ancient Athens, in contrast, is presented as disciplined and virtuous. For many scholars, the point was not that Plato wanted his readers to search the Atlantic Ocean with maps and diving equipment. The point was that even a great society can destroy itself when wealth and power outrun wisdom. Still, the story may have drawn on real memories. The ancient Mediterranean had known earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and coastal floods. The eruption of Thera, on the island now called Santorini, around the 2nd millennium BCE, devastated parts of the Aegean world. Its explosion was one of the largest volcanic events of the last several thousand years. It damaged settlements, sent waves across the sea, and may have contributed to the decline of Minoan power on Crete. Could Thera have inspired Atlantis? Possibly, in a loose sense. But the dates, locations, and details do not match Plato's account. It is better to say that real disasters may have supplied emotional material for a fictional story. Plato did not need to invent the terror of the sea. People around him already knew what the sea could do. Then, many centuries later, Atlantis stopped being only Plato's warning. It became a place people wanted to find. During the 19th century, scholars and amateur investigators were trying to explain why similar animals, fossils, languages, or myths appeared in places separated by oceans. Before plate tectonics was understood, some proposed vanished land bridges. Maybe continents had once connected lands now far apart. Maybe islands were the last mountain peaks of drowned worlds. One of these hypothetical places was Lemuria. The name was proposed in the 19th century to explain the distribution of lemurs and related animals in Madagascar and India. The idea was not originally about an advanced human civilization. It was an attempt to solve a biological puzzle using the science available at the time. But the theory escaped the laboratory. Writers, mystics, and spiritual movements transformed Lemuria into an ancient homeland of lost peoples. Some imagined it in the Indian Ocean, others placed it in the Pacific. It became associated with forgotten races, secret wisdom, and civilizations older than history. Then came Mu. Mu was popularized in the early 20th century by James Churchward, who claimed that he had learned of a vast Pacific continent from mysterious ancient tablets. According to Churchward, Mu had been the mother civilization of the world. Egypt, India, the Maya, and other ancient cultures, he believed, were only distant descendants of its survivors. It was a grand story, and it had almost no evidence. The tablets were never independently verified. The translations could not be checked. The supposed continent had no geological basis, but Mu survived because it connected so many things people wanted to connect: pyramids, symbols, flood myths, ancient wisdom, and the feeling that history must contain a hidden first chapter. Modern geology tells a different story. Continents do move. They drift, collide, split apart, and sometimes sink at their edges. But they do not usually vanish suddenly into the deep ocean like a stone dropped into water. Continental crust is relatively light. Oceanic crust is denser, thinner, and constantly created and recycled through plate tectonics. And the ocean floor has been mapped in remarkable detail. Much of it is made of volcanic basalt, not drowned continental rock. It is also geologically young. The oldest oceanic crust is usually less than about 200 million years old, because older crust is pulled down into the earth at subduction zones. A lost continent supporting a human civilization only a few thousand or even tens of thousands of years ago would leave enormous geological traces. We do find submerged continental fragments. Zealandia, mostly beneath the southwest Pacific, is a real example. But it was not a vanished human empire. Its drowning took place over immense geological timescales, long before humans existed. What did disappear within human memory were landscapes. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Coastlines moved inland. River valleys became estuaries. Plains became seabeds. Doggerland, once connecting Britain to mainland Europe, was gradually flooded. Sunderland, the broad Ice Age landscape joining many of today's Southeast Asian islands, was reduced by rising seas. For the people living there, these were not abstract changes on a map. Their hunting grounds vanished, their villages moved, familiar shorelines disappeared. Storms, tsunamis and floods could turn generations of slow change into sudden terror. Stories of land lost to water would have been entirely reasonable, and over thousands of years those memories could grow. A drowned valley becomes a drowned kingdom. A coastal disaster becomes the destruction of a whole world. A real ancestral homeland becomes Atlantis, Mu, or Lemuria. That does not make the stories meaningless. It makes them human. Atlantis endures because it speaks to something deep in us. The fear that everything we build can be erased. The hope that wisdom once existed and might be recovered. The suspicion that the ordinary version of history is too small for the mysteries we feel beneath the waves. But emotional power is not archaeological evidence. To establish Atlantis as history, we would need more than similarities, symbols, or a compelling story. We would need a real location, securely dated remains, settlements, artifacts, inscriptions, trade networks, and evidence that could be examined by many independent researchers. Until then, Atlantis remains what it has always been, a magnificent question shaped by a philosopher, enlarged by imagination, and carried forward by the ancient human memory of water rising over the land. But there is another way to approach the question. Instead of asking whether Atlantis was real, or whether a lost continent carried some forgotten mother civilization, we can ask something much more precise. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth long before us, would we be able to tell? This is the question behind something called the Silurian Hypothesis. Despite the dramatic name, it is not a claim that intelligent reptiles built factories before humans. The name comes from an old science fiction reference. The actual hypothesis was proposed by scientists as a thought experiment. Its purpose was not to prove that a prior civilization existed. Its purpose was to ask what evidence industry leaves behind, and how long that evidence might survive. It is a wonderfully unsettling question. Imagine that, 50 million years ago or 100 million years ago, some species had developed cities, machines, global trade, agriculture, mining, and energy systems. Then it vanished. Maybe climate change overwhelmed it. Maybe war, disease, asteroid impact, or simple ecological collapse ended its world. Over immense stretches of time, continents shifted. Mountains rose and wore away. Rivers changed course. Sediment buried the remains. Would there still be anything left for us to find? Probably not skyscrapers. Buildings are fragile on geological timescales. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, roads break apart. Even massive stone structures eventually collapse, are buried, dissolved, or ground into sediment. The longer the time period, the less likely it is that recognizable objects would survive. A future geologist might not find the ruins of a city. They might find only a strange layer in the rocks. And that is where the thought experiment becomes scientific. Modern industry does not just build things, it changes the chemistry of the planet. The most obvious signal is carbon. When we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, we release carbon that was locked underground for millions of years. This carbon has a distinctive isotopic signature. Carbon comes in slightly different forms, called isotopes, and ancient plant matter tends to be relatively low in carbon-13. When enough fossil carbon enters the atmosphere and oceans, it can leave a detectable shift in sediments. Future researchers studying the rocks of our time may see a sudden carbon isotope change. They may also see signs of rapid warming, changing ocean chemistry, widespread extinctions, and disrupted ecosystems. In other words, they might recognize that something unusual happened. They might even recognize that it happened extremely fast, but they might not immediately know why. Earth has experienced natural carbon releases before. Volcanic eruptions, methane emissions, and enormous changes in ecosystems can also alter the carbon record. Around 56 million years ago, during an event called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, global temperatures rose sharply and carbon isotopes shifted dramatically. The cause is still studied and debated in detail. No one thinks it was ancient industry. But it shows how nature can produce signals that at first glance might resemble the aftermath of industrial activity. So carbon alone would not be enough. A prior industrial civilization might also leave unusual patterns of metals. Humans extract and concentrate vast quantities of copper, lead, chromium, aluminum, rare earth elements, and other materials. Mining moves rocks from deep underground, refines them, transports them, and scatters their products across the planet. Landfills, industrial waste, and dust from smelters create chemical patterns that do not occur in quite the same way through ordinary geology. Then there are synthetic compounds, plastics, pesticides, industrial chemicals, and some radioactive materials are among the stranger fingerprints of our age. Many individual plastic objects will break down. Sunlight, heat, water, and microbes will attack them. But fragments can persist, becoming part of sediments. Some synthetic molecules are remarkably durable. Radioactive isotopes created by nuclear testing have known half-lives and could mark a very narrow moment in time. Our civilization is also reshaping the physical surface of Earth at astonishing speed. We dig quarries, we level mountains, we dam rivers. We move more sediment each year through construction, farming and mining than many natural processes move on their own. We alter the nitrogen cycle by manufacturing fertilizers. We change the distribution of species by carrying animals, plants and microbes across oceans. Taken together, these are not just artifacts. They are a planetary disturbance. That is the real point of the Silurian Hypothesis. If someone makes the extraordinary claim that a deep-time industrial civilization existed, the evidence should also be extraordinary. Not a mysterious stone, not an old map with uncertain origins, not a myth that can be interpreted in many ways. We would expect multiple signals in the same securely dated geological layer. Chemical anomalies, sudden carbon changes, strange concentrations of refined metals, persistent synthetic compounds, evidence of mass extraction, ecosystem disruption, perhaps even a sharp extinction event. And if distant researchers ever study our own thin layer of rock, they may find exactly that. They may not know our names, they may never recover our languages, our stories, or the reasons we did what we did. But they may see the scar we left in the planet itself, which means the question is no longer only whether ancient civilizations could disappear. It is also whether ours is becoming impossible to miss. But once you begin looking for traces of lost civilizations, another question almost always appears. What if the evidence was found already? What if museums locked it away, universities ignored it, governments classified it, or religious institutions removed it because it challenged the official story? This is one of the most powerful ideas in the world of forbidden history. And it has power for a simple reason. History really has been hidden before. Not always through secret meetings in underground rooms. Often through war, empire, greed, prejudice, bureaucracy, or the quiet decision that some stories mattered more than others. Museums are often accused because they hold enormous collections that the public never sees. And this part is true. Major museums may have millions of objects in storage. Only a small percentage can fit into galleries. Archaeologists excavate pottery fragments, animal bones, soil samples, broken tools, beads, textiles, and countless ordinary objects. Most of it is catalogued, studied when possible, and stored because there is simply not enough space to display everything. A box in storage is not necessarily a secret, but storage can become a problem when records are poor, access is limited, or institutions fail to explain what they have and why it is not on display. An artifact without a clear catalogue number, excavation record, or known location can effectively vanish from public knowledge. And that has happened many times. Colonial collecting created some of the deepest wounds in the history of archaeology. European empires removed sculptures, manuscripts, human remains, ceremonial objects, and whole sections of monuments from Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. Some were taken through legal agreements made under unequal conditions. Others were looted outright. Some objects ended up in private collections. Some were sold, damaged, mislabeled, or separated from the places and communities that gave them meaning. When people say history was taken from us, that is not always a metaphor. Sometimes it is a precise description of what happened. War has done the same thing on an even larger scale. Libraries burn, archives are bombed, museums are emptied. Records disappear during revolutions, invasions, and civil wars. The ancient world was full of documents written on clay, papyrus, wood, silk, bark, leather, and paper. Most of these materials do not survive under ordinary conditions. What remains can feel miraculous. What is gone is beyond calculation. The Library of Alexandria has become the great symbol of lost knowledge, though its destruction was probably not one single dramatic event. It was more likely a long process of decline, neglect, political conflict, and repeated damage over centuries. Still, the basic lesson remains: knowledge can be lost. Entire traditions can be broken. A text copied for hundreds of years may disappear because one generation fails to make the next copy. Religious and political censorship are real too. Rulers have banned books. States have rewritten histories. Religious authorities have condemned ideas they considered dangerous. Archaeological sites have been destroyed because they belonged to an unwanted past. In some places, excavations have been restricted for reasons of national security, religious sensitivity, land rights, or politics. So, skepticism toward institutions is not automatically irrational. Institutions are made of people. People have blind spots, careers, loyalties, budgets, and fears. They can be wrong, they can protect reputations, they can overlook evidence that does not fit familiar expectations. But there is an important difference between bias, neglect, and wrongdoing on one hand, and a coordinated global deletion of all evidence on the other. That second claim is much harder to support. Archaeology is not controlled by one museum, one government, or one university. It is conducted across dozens of countries by public institutions, private researchers, local communities, students, journalists, volunteers, and competing academic teams. Excavations produce field notes, photographs, maps, radiocarbon dates, laboratory reports, soil samples, and publications. Objects are often studied by specialists who have never met each other. A single discovery may be tested in several laboratories using different methods. And researchers disagree constantly. They argue over dates, interpretations, translations, migration routes, climate records, and the meaning of a broken piece of stone. Sometimes fiercely. If convincing evidence of a forgotten industrial civilization appeared, the person who demonstrated it would not merely be risking their career. They would be making one of the greatest discoveries in human history. That is not a system designed to make every radical idea disappear. It is a messy system, sometimes slow and unfair, but one where extraordinary evidence attracts enormous attention. The strongest evidence is also difficult to hide because it does not exist in only one place. A genuine ancient civilization should leave patterns: settlements, burials, tools, food remains, trade goods, altered landscapes, mines, roads, waste deposits, written records, if writing existed, and for an industrial society, the kind of planetary chemical signature we just explored. Remove one artifact, and perhaps you remove one clue, but remove an entire civilization, and you would have to erase clues from river valleys, caves, seabeds, quarries, laboratories, museum collections, satellite surveys, and geological layers across continents. You would have to persuade thousands of independent people across generations and political systems to keep the same secret while leaving no reliable trail of the suppression itself. That does not mean every claim of hidden history is false. It means we should ask careful questions before deciding what happened. Where did the artifact come from? Was it found during a documented excavation, or did it appear without a clear origin? Is there a precise location, a date, photographs from discovery, and an unbroken record of who handled it? Has it been examined by qualified specialists? Can other researchers study it? Has it been tested with methods appropriate to its material and age? And perhaps most importantly, does the claim rest on one mysterious object? Or does it fit a wider pattern of evidence? A hidden archive is possible. A lost manuscript is possible. A looted object in a private collection is possible. Human history is full of absences, silences, and damaged records. But an erased civilization would need more than a story about what was hidden. It would need traces that survive the hiding. And this brings us to the central question. If there really was an advanced civilization before the civilizations we know, What would the missing evidence actually need to show? Not just one strange object, not one map that might be misread, not one wall whose age is uncertain, or one legend that sounds surprisingly modern when translated into English. It would need to show a pattern. A civilization is not a single artifact. It is a system. It is people living together at scale, organizing food, labor, trade, belief, power, and knowledge over many generations. Even when its buildings collapse and its books rot away, that system leaves consequences behind. Think about the civilizations we do know. Mesopotamia left cities, canals, tablets, seals, fields altered by irrigation, trade goods, temples, graves, and layers of everyday rubbish. Egypt left settlements, quarry marks, tools, tombs, inscriptions, harbours, workshops, and chemical traces from ancient industry. The Indus civilization left planned cities, standardized weights, seals, drainage systems, craft production, and trade connections extending far beyond its own river valleys. None of these civilizations depends on one miraculous discovery. Their evidence overlaps. Archaeology supports geology. Geography supports written records. Plant remains support evidence of farming. Human bones support evidence of diet, disease, migration, and population change. Objects found hundreds of miles apart reveal trade networks because they share materials, styles, measurements, or manufacturing techniques. That is what convincing evidence looks like. Different kinds of clues discovered by different people in different places, all pointing in the same direction. So a prior civilization, especially one more advanced than the first known cities, would need to leave something similar. It might leave settlements, perhaps buried beneath later towns, deserts, forests, or coastlines now underwater. It might leave roads, canals, ports, terraces, mines, quarries, or managed landscapes. It might leave workshops full of slag, broken tools, discarded ceramics, pigments, glass, metal fragments, or the waste produced by large-scale manufacturing. If it had agriculture, we would expect changes in pollen, seeds, animal bones, soils, and erosion patterns. Forests cleared for fields do not simply vanish without a trace. Domesticated plants and animals carry their own histories in their genes and bones. Irrigation can alter river sediments. Intensive farming can leave pollen signals, charcoal layers, and long-term changes in the chemistry of the ground. If it had writing, we might hope for inscriptions, tablets, seals, marked objects, or repeated symbols in clear archaeological contexts. Writing is fragile, of course. Ink on wood, cloth, bark, and skin can disappear almost completely. But writing is also useful. Societies that write tend to write often. They label goods, record debts, mark ownership, dedicate monuments, make lists, and leave accidental scraps behind. And if the lost civilization was industrial, the evidence would need to become even more visible. Large-scale metal production requires mines, furnaces, fuel, transport, labor, and waste. Mining scars landscapes. Smelting produces slag. Coal burning, oil extraction, and chemical manufacturing can leave unusual traces in sediments, ice cores, or ocean floors. A society using advanced materials might leave alloys, synthetic compounds, altered isotopes, or fragments of substances not easily created by natural processes. Not every trace would survive. That is important. Time destroys almost everything. But an industrial civilization would not be only a collection of finished machines. It would be a vast network of extraction, energy use, construction, trade, waste, and environmental change. You could melt the machines, bury the cities, and lose the names of the people who made them. Yet the wider footprint might remain. This is why isolated anomalies are not enough. A metal object found out of place could be intrusive, modern, mislabeled, contaminated, or incorrectly dated. A stone formation can resemble a wall without being built by people. An aerial image can suggest pyramids, roads, or foundations, when it is really geology, vegetation, shadows, or later activity. A story can preserve a distant memory without being a literal account of a vanished global empire. An anomaly is a question. A pattern is an answer beginning to take shape. And even then, the pattern has to be tested carefully. Where exactly was the object found? Was it excavated layer by layer with notes, photographs, maps, and samples? Or did it appear on a market shelf, in an old collection, or in a viral photograph with no clear history? This is called provenance. It simply means the documented origin and history of an object. Provenance is not boring paperwork. It is what tells us whether an artifact belongs to the place and period claimed for it. Then comes stratigraphy. In simple terms, archaeologists study layers. In an undisturbed site, deeper layers are usually older than the layers above them. A Roman coin found in Roman soil tells us one thing. The same coin found in a modern animal burrow that cut down through ancient layers tells us something very different. Dating matters too. Radiocarbon dating can help date once living materials such as charcoal, bone, seeds, and wood. Luminescence methods can estimate when sediments were last exposed to light or heated. Tree rings, ice layers, volcanic ash, uranium series dating, and other methods can sometimes provide additional checks. No method is perfect by itself, but when several methods agree, confidence grows. And confidence grows even more when independent researchers can inspect the evidence, repeat the tests, challenge the conclusions, and still arrive at roughly the same result. That process can feel slow. It can seem less exciting than a dramatic claim made overnight. But it is how history becomes stronger. New discoveries really can revise the story. Göbekli Tepe changed ideas about monument building before agriculture was fully established. Ancient DNA has transformed our understanding of migration and interbreeding. Underwater archaeology continues to reveal drowned settlements, harbours and landscapes that were once dry land. Every year, remote sensing finds sites hidden beneath forests, deserts, farms and modern cities. So the past is not finished. Far from it, there may be coastal settlements now beneath the sea. There may be forgotten regional cultures in places archaeologists have barely surveyed. There may be manuscripts in caves, ruins beneath sediment, and entire chapters of human life waiting in landscapes we have not learned how to read. But this openness is not the same as proof. The fact that history can change does not mean every alternative theory is equally likely. It means a theory must meet the evidence where it is. A claim of a lost fishing village needs evidence appropriate to a village. A claim of a forgotten kingdom needs evidence appropriate to a kingdom. A claim of a global advanced civilization needs a footprint large enough to match the claim. The missing evidence does not need to be impossible. It needs to be coherent, and until that coherent pattern appears, the honest position is not that wonder has failed. It is that wonder is still doing its real work. It is keeping us curious enough to search and careful enough to know the difference between a mystery and an answer. That difference matters because the seventh civilization claim asks us to make a very large leap. It suggests that before the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, the Americas, and every other known center of early complexity, there was another great human world, perhaps an older global civilization, perhaps one with lost technology, forgotten knowledge, and monuments erased so completely that only myths, anomalies, and scattered fragments remain. It is a powerful idea, and it speaks to something deep in us. We look at ancient ruins and feel the distance between our lives and theirs. We see stones fitted so carefully that they still stand after thousands of years. We find a script nobody can read. We discover a village beneath the sea, a burial in a cave, a tool buried in sediment older than any written memory. And naturally, we wonder what else has been lost. The honest answer is, a great deal. Most human lives leave almost nothing behind. A shelter made of wood, reeds, skins, or earth can disappear. A spoken language can vanish without a single word being recorded. A shoreline settlement can be swallowed by rising water. A field can become forest, then grassland, then desert. Rivers move, coasts drown, glaciers scrape the ground clean. Later cities build directly on top of earlier ones. The archive of the past is incomplete by its nature. But incomplete does not mean empty, and it does not mean we have to invent a hidden empire to make prehistory astonishing. Human prehistory is already full of mystery, ingenuity, loss, and transformation, on a scale almost too large to hold in the mind. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans and other human species adapted to changing climates. Learned landscapes, made tools, cared for children, buried their dead, crossed mountains, followed herds, and sailed toward islands beyond the horizon. Then, after the last ice age, whole worlds disappeared beneath the sea. The coastlines where many people lived were not fixed. When the ice sheets melted, oceans rose by more than 100 meters in some places. Land that once connected islands became water. Plains became seabeds. River valleys became bays. Communities that may have lived near fresh water, fish, shellfish, and migratory animals now lie beyond the reach of ordinary excavation. That is not fantasy. It is geology, and it means there are real discoveries still waiting beneath the waves. There are also forests where no large-scale surveys have been made. Deserts where shifting sand can hide structures for centuries. Deep river sediments, mountain caves, peat bogs, and modern cities built over older towns. New methods are helping archaeologists look in places that once seemed impossible. Satellite images can reveal ancient field systems. Ground-penetrating radar can find walls beneath streets. DNA from soil can identify people and animals even when bones are gone. Tiny traces of pollen, charcoal, starch, and chemical residue can tell stories no monument ever could. So yes, the past will continue to surprise us. It may reveal older villages, earlier trade networks, more seafaring than we expected, new human populations, new forms of ritual, farming, art, and social organization. It may force historians to redraw maps, revise dates, and admit that people in the distant past were more inventive than old textbooks allowed. That has happened before. It will happen again. But real curiosity does not require one predetermined answer. It does not begin by deciding that there must have been a seventh civilization, then treating every unanswered question as proof that it existed. Real curiosity can live with uncertainty. It can say, "We do not know yet." It can welcome the evidence, even when the evidence leads somewhere less dramatic but more true. Because the truth is dramatic enough. The first cities were not inevitable. Writing was not inevitable. Farming was not inevitable. The survival of our own species was not inevitable. Every ruined temple, broken pot, drowned harbour, and undeciphered symbol is a reminder that the world we inherited was built by people who did not know they were becoming history. Maybe that is the wonder worth keeping, not the comforting idea that someone before us had already solved every mystery, but the stranger, more humbling possibility that generation after generation faced an uncertain world and kept creating new ways to live within it. So are we the seventh civilization, based on the evidence we have explored? There is no convincing archaeological, geological, genetic, or environmental pattern showing that a vanished advanced global civilization existed before the known rise of complex societies. There are mysteries. There are missing chapters, There are real gaps in the record. But gaps are invitations to investigate, not blank spaces where any story can be placed. And perhaps as you drift towards sleep, that is enough. The past is deeper than we imagine. The evidence is still coming to light, and somewhere beneath a field, a forest, a city, or a quiet stretch of sea, another piece of the human story may still be waiting. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know where you're listening from tonight. It is always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. Until next time, sleep well, stay curious, and let the mysteries remain mysteries until the evidence is ready to speak.